Testing. Testing. Okay. Here we go. Here we go. Let's start this over. What's up, y'all? What's good? Welcome to the What Up Doe Show. It's your boy Dame D, and I am back with another one. Here we go. Let's start. All right, there we go. So we had to start it over. My bad. My volume wasn't up, so now you guys can hear me. What's going on out there, everybody? We back with another one. It's your boy Dame D, and y'all see the title in the in the topic and the title up top. The devious and mischievous things we did as teenagers. I'm gonna wait for a few people to jump in, and we'll just start tonight's conversation. It's gonna not gonna be long, but just quick. And today's conversation was stemming from a conversation that I had at work, and we were just talking about teenagers and how they act and the things that the devious and mischievous things we do, and things that that we've done as teenagers, I should say. Sorry about that. Yep. So what's going on out there, man? Who watched those games today? Before we start up the conversation, I'm gonna wait for a few more people to jump in, and we'll start the conversation up. But I hate that I started it off and you guys couldn't hear me. But hopefully everybody can hear me now, and we'll get the conversation going. I'm just getting in from work. I want to come in and just talk about this for a little bit. Hopefully everybody had a great day. It was hot in the city of Detroit today. I believe it got up to around 87, close to 90 degrees. Well, at least that's what my temperature was saying in my car. Yep. So it was definitely a hot one. It looked like we're going to start off. We're starting off with didn't start off too good with a spring, but it looked like we're going right into summer. So it looked like we skipped spring and jumping right into summer, with the weather that we had the last few days. But it's supposed to be cooling back down too. So yeah, but I just want to make sure that everybody can hear me and see me. So I'm still waiting for a few more people to jump in before I start today's conversation. But before we start it up, I need for you guys to like, comment, subscribe, and share. We definitely need you guys to hit that subscribe button. Your boy is close to his goal over here. And 1,000 subscribers, so I cannot do it without you guys hitting that subscribe button. So we got a few people checking in. We're going ahead and start up the conversation. We're going to talk about the devious and mischievous things that we've done as teenagers, and then just kind of blend it in with the teenagers of today. The conversation that I'm going to talk about kind of is stemming from a conversation that I had at work with one of my coworkers, and we were just talking about a certain situation where the coworker that I was talking to, her stepdaughter got caught at the house with her boyfriend, and I believe and I don't want to quote, they may have been having sex, and the father came in and caught them. He actually came home early from work and caught the teenager at home. And I just and like I said, it was a conversation that we talked about. I'm like, well, hold on, let me check the comments. CC Motion, what up, though? What's good with you? CC Motion. Like I said, we're having a conversation about the devious and mischievous things that we did as teenagers, and I was talking to a co-worker whose daughter got caught by the father at home. Both of the parents were at work. One of the father ended up coming home from work, caught the daughter at home with the boyfriend having sex. And we talked about that. I'm like, well, you have to kind of expect things like that. Those are things that teenagers do, because I went back to my childhood when I was a teenager, and I remember my first girlfriend. Her parents they worked second and third. Let me see, what shift was it? Second and third shift. So I was over there all the time, doing, just being devious. I'm not going to say just being devious, but being a teenager, having sex and, doing things that, that we shouldn't be doing, and we just had that conversation. And this goes back to another coworker that I had. I'm like, that's why it's important to have, a father figure in the house, because most fathers are there to stop that. But in this situation, the father was at home and in the house, and it still happened. So, and that's why I just talked about the situation. I'm like, look, I'm like, you will be. I'm like, this probably wasn't the first time that they did that. She just got caught. You know, and it's stemming from just other people that was jumping in and out of the conversations, and this is for the teens of today. I'll get to that part. To do you think it's harder for the teens of today to get away with sneaking your boyfriend or girlfriend in trying to have sex, because most people, they were talking about how they got cameras all throughout the house, and it's impossible for their kids to bring anybody in the house without knowing. And I'm like, it's always dead spots, where the camera can't see where they're going to sneak people in. And the same thing with my coworker who daughter got caught. They had cameras in their house, but she was sneaking. I believe she was sneaking them in through a basement window. You know what I mean? So it was just crazy, man. Things that teenagers will do, to have sex, because I remember when I was a teenager, like I said, my first girlfriend, her parents, they worked third shift. So, I was always over there, damn near every day. So I don't know if it would be a lot. Well, it probably was a lot easier for people in my time to get away with things like that. Because like I said today, everybody has cameras and ring and things like that. So but like I was telling them, I'm like, look, when a teenager hit their sexual, I'm not going to say sexual peak, but when they start having sex, there's nothing you can do to stop them from getting together. And that's real talk. Yep. So I just want to come in and conversate. We got a few people jumping in and jumping out. The conversation. I wanted to wait until the weekend and do this, but I said I was going to come on tonight and talk about it. But yeah, I remember my first girlfriend, and I was over there like I lived there some of the time. I'm not going to say like I lived there, but we had no problem doing what we needed to do. So and I talked to another one of my coworkers, and he comes from, a two-family household, and he said basically he was basically, stating like it was hard for him to be able to bring, women and sneak girls into the house because his parents or one of his parents was always there at the house, and which is understandable, and I talked about that, and and it kind of made me think about my situation, with my girlfriend. Her father was in her life, but he was not living there at the house. So I was able to come and go, and we were able to sneak around as we please. So and that stemmed, and I thought about that. I'm like, you know what? And I thought about one of my other girlfriends that I had when I was in high school, who had her mom and her dad there at the house. We would never be able to go to her house and do what we did or have sex and things like that. You know what I mean? So it's so parents who's watching second and third shift, man, those are the times where your teenagers are going to be doing the devious and mischievous things while you're at work and you're gone. So you have to, and this is what I told to my coworker. I'm like, look, we once were all teens. We once snuck around and did things, and that's when you kind of come around to, indulging in things like that, because nowadays these teens they're having sex at 11 and 12 years old. So 14-year-old kid, and like I said, at that time when I was sneaking around and doing, my dirt, I was around 14 years old, and my girlfriend, she was, I believe, 15 at the time. So she was sneaking me around, and girls are way more sneakier than we are. She was getting me in, getting me out. Her parents, had no clue of what was going on. So I want you guys to give me your opinion, give me your thoughts on that situation. Do you remember when you were a teenager? Do you remember getting snuck in by your girlfriend or getting snuck in by your boyfriend? Because more than likely, it was more than likely the young women, the girlfriends that were sneaking the boyfriends in. You know what I mean? Because, like I said, I had no problem. We had no problems doing what we had to do. It was like, we was playing house. CC motion. But yeah, man, I just want to come in. Like I said, I wanted to save this conversation and this topic for this weekend because that's a good conversation and a good topic. And I probably still will, just talk about this and bring it up this weekend because it's a good conversation, because we all been teenagers, we all, done things like sneaking our girlfriends and boyfriends into the house without our parents knowing, so that's why and this kind of stem, and this was a good conversation to have, because it's that's why it's always great, to have both of the parents in the house, because it's almost impossible. I'm not going to say impossible, but it just depends on what shift your parents are working, and normally, most parents would work the opposite shifts. Therefore, there's someone always home supervising the kids. Because when you have one parent, those kids are doing whatever the fuck they want to do. They're running the house. And like I said, females, they are very devious and sneaky. Like I said, my girlfriend, she was bringing me in at will. It was like we was playing house at JJ Good Times. You were meant to see, people always got to come in making stupid comments. But yeah, man, I remember, my girlfriend sneaking me in and out of the house. And, and her parents were her parents worked third shift. So, I had no problem sneaking in and we had no problems doing the things that, we wanted to do. So that's why it's always a positive or a great thing to have both parents in the house, because when teenagers get to smelling themselves, and I'll just say it like that, and like I said, young females, they will do anything, and everything to sneak that boy in the house. And I was talking to my coworker, I'm like, that's not the first time that she don't snuck him in that house. They just got caught. So so they may and might want to change their schedule. You know what I mean? Because if she's because like I said, she's probably been doing that for a long time, depending on how their schedules was, and she just ended up getting caught. And that's all that was. Golden Eagle, Master King, what's good with you? I'm gonna I'll read that off. He wrote Ephesians 5-8. For ye were sometimes darkness, but now are ye light in the Lord. Walk as children of light, for the fruit and spirit is all in goodness and righteousness. It kind of sounds like what goes on in the dark will come to the light. And I agree, I agree with that scripture, and that's but as teenagers and kids, we're gonna, you have to expect for teenagers to do things like that. That's and I'm not gonna say that's kind of should be written for adults, but teenagers, there you kind of have to expect for them to try to do things like this. So you always have to enforce. What up, Aries 989? Say lions suck, but Jesus do not. The Lions do not suck. And we're gonna have a conversation in a topic in the upcoming weeks about the whole Jesus thing. Because you have a lot of people. And I won't even go off into that, but we'll save that. And I definitely want you to join that conversation. Harris 989. Because you have a lot of people that do not believe that Jesus actually was a real figure. It was you have a lot of people um coming to understand that it was just a story that was told. And if you go back to the African folk tales, where you have Asar, Aset, and Eru, this was a story that was stolen by Europeans, and they put their own twist on it with Jesus. So if you go back to the original story, this was just a story. It wasn't believed to think that Jesus actually walked this earth. So if you go to the originator, the people who actually made this story, it was stolen by Europeans. And like I said, when the Bible and all that stuff was invented, then they added the whole Jesus and all that. So truthfully, if you want to go by the originators, that the Jesus did not exist. He was just a character, pretty much. And you can't go, and you have no proof of that either. Either way. So but that's going to be another conversation that we're definitely going to have, because I had a short that I did about that, and I asked a question about is Jesus Christ the only way? By accepting Jesus Christ, is that the only way that you can make it through heaven? You have a lot of people in a lot of religions that does not accept Jesus Christ and that believe that there's a place for it in heaven. But I don't want to get off the topic. We're talking about the devious and mischievous things that we did as teenagers. So let's. I'm going to stay on topic, but we're definitely going to have that conversation, Aaron. And I would love for you to be part of that conversation in that show and actually come live up on the panel and talk about it. So make sure that you hit that subscribe button so you will be in tune when we do talk about that. But yeah, man, I need for you guys to give me your thoughts, your opinion on, the things that you did as a teenager. We were just talking, like I said, I was talking to one of my coworkers, and her daughter was caught by the father having sex with the boyfriend in the house. And I'm like, okay, those are things that's going to happen from teenagers. Okay, and Aaron 989 said not only was he real, he wasn't white as people say. Okay, well, can you prove that? Can you prove that he was real? Give me proof. But like I said, I would love for you to join the conversation when we actually come back and talk about that. But give me your thoughts, man, on tonight's topic, tonight's conversation, the devious and mischievous things we did as teenagers. And like I said, I was just talking about a teen who was caught by her father, brought a young man in the house and they were having sex. He caught them red-handed in the act. And like I said, I remember when I was a teenager and my girlfriend, she would sneak me in at will. Her parent worked third shift, so they were pretty much never there. I would be able to be over there at hours at a time, and never got caught ever. So yeah, it's certain things that you can try to have all the cameras. Um, you can try to have the ring cameras. You can try to do everything you want to do, but there's no stopping a teenagers that want to have sex, that's in love. That's kind of like the whole Romeo and Juliet story. They died to be with each other. So when you have two teenagers who want to be with each other, there's nothing that pretty much you can do to stop it. Especially in nowadays. Yep. So, like I said, I wanted to save this topic and this conversation for this weekend, and I'll probably bring it back up, because I'm just getting off of work and I wanted to come in and talk about it. We don't had a few people jumping in and jumping out, but I definitely wanted to have a steady and regular conversation with you guys about this topic because it's a good conversation, and these are conversations that single parents need to hear and listen about, and a lot of parents may not be um informed about what's going on or the things that go on, when they're at work. They may have an idea, but most parents do not think that they children, would bring somebody in, while they're not at home, but you cannot underestimate a teenagers that that's having sex, because once a teen start having sex, that's all they want to do, so you can, like I said, you can put up all the cameras and door rings in the world. They're going to find a dead spot. They're going to do find the window where that camera is not at to bring he or she in the house. At King Widow said blacks sold blacks to whites. Okay, so that's for another conversation. What do they have to do with the devious and mischievous things we do as teenagers? But I'm just trying to stay on topic, and I was just talking in King Widow. I and you had another guy that made a comment. about the whole yeah, Aaron 989. And I asked him, I said, I said, prove it. Prove that Jesus is real. Prove it. Most people can't prove that he actually, walked this earth. Most people are just going off of hearsay, and the things that we were given. And that's the only thing that you can go on. It's just faith. Most Christians are going off of just faith. But like I was trying to tell him, if you go back to the original African folktale story, the Aru, Asar, and the Set, it was just a story that was told by peoples, not to think that he well, they didn't even talk about the Jesus thing. It was just a Set, Asar, and Aru, and the Europeans took that whole the Holy Trinity thing and turned it into what they have now. But like I said, that's another day, another conversation, that we're going to have in the upcoming weeks about that. I did a short about that, and it was a good short. So I'm going to lead off into a show talking about that, and have a few things written down and jotting down to go off of. But yeah, man, and the things that teenagers do, when their parents are working second and third shift. How many of you guys remember the things that you did as a teenager, when your parents worked second and third shift? Because I can remember, and I have a older brother and a younger sister, and I remember me and my brother, boy, we was doing all type of stuff when my mom was at work, so listen, you can have all the cameras. Well, it's probably a little different, with the cameras and things like that, but it's always a way around the camera. Children, teenagers would do anything and everything to sneak a motherfucker in. You gotta realize that. Yeah, because they're some horny toads. hmm so so it's rough for parents that work second and third shift that has young, especially young girls. Because it's the young girls that does the sneaking. That brings the boys in. Because um I remember when I was 14 years old, and I remember having a girlfriend, and I remember her parents worked third shift. I was over there at all times of the night doing any and everything that I wanted to do. So like I said, this was a conversation that was stemming from a conversation that I had at work. A young woman got caught by her father. She had snuck her boyfriend in, and the dad ended up coming home early from work, catching her in the act of having sex. Yep. So, but yeah, man, the teens of today versus when we grew up, it's a lot different. They have the technology to be able to work with. We just only thing we went off of is we knew our mom was at work. They got like I said, the internet, the computers, cell phones, and things like that. So they can be a lot more devious than we were. Yep. So yeah, I need for you guys to like, comment, subscribe, and share. Give me your thoughts on the things that you did when your mom and dad was at work. How you snuck your boyfriend or how you snuck your girlfriend in. Because I remember I can give you stories when I was in high school. Where my high school girlfriend snuck me in. You know, um, and her mom and what's so crazy, her mom and dad was at the house. I remember that. Yeah. So really it doesn't matter. You have to watch your kids at all times, because like I said, I just thought about that. My high school girlfriend, she snuck me in. And her mom and dad was there at the house, which we got caught, which was crazy. So her mom caught us. Not in the act, but we got caught. I was hiding on the side of the bed, and she came down there and she caught me. But like I said, it's the girls that's more devious than the young men are. Because like I said, every time that I did go somewhere, it was always my girlfriend who would sneak me in. I'm not gonna say I never had to sneak them to my house. They always brought me there to their houses. Because like I said, at a certain time, the parents would be at work, and we was able to do what we wanted to do. Yep. So, you just have to have conversations with your children, you know, talked about the ins and outs, about, sex and things like that, and just the consequences. Because they're going to do what they want to do regardless. You just have to you just have to have conversations with them about sex and things like that. Because like I said, it was always the females who was sneaking, me into the house versus me bringing them to my house. So, and so parents, you have to watch what schedules you're working. You know what I mean? So it's always, and it's kind of, most parents will work first shift to try to be there with their kids when they get off and throughout the night. Yep. So it's always, and that's going to lead back to the conversation about, having both parents there in the household. Because when the dad's there, he's the camera, he's the security, he's the ring camera to be able to stop, things like that. And that's what I was talking about. When there's a father there in the household, more than likely, the kids are going to think twice trying to sneak or bring somebody in. But when there's only a one parent household, and that mom, and depending on what shift she's worked, if she worked third shift, oh, best believe she's sneaking boys up in there. So you just gotta, like I said, you just have to be mindful. You have to have regular conversations with your kids, because kids are going to be kids regardless. You can have all the talks and conversations in the world. Once they start feeling themselves and, thinking that they're in love, there's nothing that they won't do to try to see this man, or, this young man or this young woman, their boyfriend or girlfriend, I should say. Like I said, like the whole Romeo and Juliet, they're almost willing to die. Yep. So I would love for you guys to give me your thoughts, your opinions on, some of the things that you may done as a teenager that was devious or mischievous, or trying to sneak your girlfriend or your boyfriend in the house. Were you guys ever caught? Have you ever been caught trying to sneak your girlfriend or your boyfriend in the house as a teenager? Because all of us probably has tried it, depending on, what shift your mom worked. If your parents work second and third shift, it's on. You got free will to do whatever you want to do. And you may even have a parent that work first shift that goes to bed at a certain time. Um, these kids of today, they will sneak a motherfucker right in there, and you can be in your room sleeping, not even know. It's a motherfucker in there fucking your kid. Yep. So, like I said, man, you can have all the alarms, you can have all the cameras, the bells and the whistles and all that. When a team want to, do something, they're gonna figure out a way. You just have conversations and trust, and your teenager, your child, and just have a great relationship with your child, and hope and pray, and just instill, the righteousness in them, so that what they won't have to, be sneaking and geeking. So look, man, I don't want to hold you guys up. I just want to come in and talk about this conversation for a little bit. And like I said, we'll probably bring this back up and talk about this over the weekend, or on Freestyle Friday, the devious and mischievous things we did as teenagers. Because like I said, I remember my girlfriend, she snuck me in, almost every time that we wanted to get together. Because her parents worked third shift, so it was never a problem with me coming over there. Yep. So like I said, we just have to be mindful. We have to just talk to our kids, and talk about the repercussions and the consequences of being sneaky and devious and mischievous. Because with the girls, babies come with that. Disease come with sneaking and being mischievous. So you kind of got to put that fear in them, until they get to, a responsible age where, they're able to not sneak. You know what I mean? Because like I said, at the end of the day, kids, once they start smelling themselves, they're going to sneak. They're going to be interested. They're going to do things like that, so you just have to be mindful. You have to be mindful and think about when you were a teenager and the things that you tried to get away with or the things that you did get away with. You know what I mean? Yep. So I just want to come on and talk about that for a hot second. I need you guys to like, comment, subscribe, and share. It's another one. It's your boy Dame D. And give me your opinion on that. Leave it in the comment section. Let me know what the devious and mischievous things that you did as a teenager growing up, and did you ever get caught? Like I said, both of my girlfriends, I remember my first love and my high school girlfriend, they would always sneak me in, and I got caught once. We got caught once, and that was with my high school girlfriend. But my first love, when I think I was like 14, 15, and 16, we were together for like three to 4 years, we've never got caught. Yep. So look, it's another one. It's a good conversation to have. With your kids. Definitely have that conversation with your kids. But look, I'm not gonna hold you guys up. It's another one. It's your boy Dame D, and I am out. Peace.